My first day at school was in a tent. We were seated on bare ground all day, with the tent walls separating us from the destruction left behind by a cyclone. I'm from Fiji. It's a popular tourist destination. We have the sandy beaches, the palm trees, and the smiley faces. We also have cyclones, floods, and landslides. Growing up in Fiji, I had seen my parents prepare for cyclones. They would get tree branches pruned back. They would ensure that window shutters were available if needed. They would stock up on things like food, candles, and batteries. Perhaps this is why the cyclones we had been through were fun family time, telling stories around the candlelight, until that first day of school. However, I didn't fully realize and appreciate all that my parents did to keep us safe from the cyclones until I started working in the field of disaster risk reduction. There are certain mindsets and behaviors that hinder us from preparing for disasters. One example is our perception of what causes a disaster. Disasters are perceived by many as God's will, punishing people because the world has become too sinful. If you think this is a perception of the past, let me point out that following Hurricane Katrina, the mayor of New Orleans is said to have stated, "Surely God is mad at America," in his speech of January 16, 2006. Similar explanations have been given for the disasters in Haiti. I wanted to share this picture of a painting that I saw in my colleague's office at the Snow and Avalanche Research Institute in Davos. My colleague explained that many of the churches in Switzerland's mountains are built in the most dangerous places because people believe that nothing will happen to them during an avalanche or a rockfall. And here you can see people being caught in an avalanche while praying at a church in Grand Saint-Bernard. Here's another picture taken just a few weekends ago that shows that such churches and such places still exist today. A second factor influencing our mindset and behavior is our tendency to be reactive rather than proactive. Think about the last holiday you planned. You probably checked your budget, the weather, and the recreational opportunities available. When we consider a destination for a holiday, we do not think about the potential for a disaster. Why would you? You're going on a holiday. Unless a disaster's just happened, which is when we write that destination off, or at least until the media hype is over. However, what if there hadn't been a recent disaster? How many of us would proactively seek information on the history of disasters in that area? For that matter, how many of us would seek this information when buying a home, locating a business, or choosing a school for children? A third factor influencing mindset and behavior is our willingness to forget the pain and suffering caused by disasters. This discourages us from learning from past events. Disaster management specialist Murali Tumadukudi asserted in a previous TEDx talk that wars are remembered over generations, but disasters are forgotten. While countries such as Japan and Indonesia use folklore, legends, and proverbs to record their disasters, most of us do not know what the major disasters were in our own countries in the last 100 years. Did you know that 1,500 years ago, Geneva, just 70 kilometers from where we are today, was destroyed by a giant wave in the lake? I imagine those of you who know learned of it from last November's edition of The Economist, which published an article titled Lake Monsters. The article states that, and I quote, "Unfortunately, for the 1 million people who live around the lake shore, the conclusion of this research is that something similar could easily happen again." Has Geneva forgotten this disaster? Most likely yes, if you consider how extensively the lake shore has been developed. And yet, the likelihood of a giant wave in the lake is perhaps greater than the likelihood of wars that we study about in school being repeated in Switzerland. Looking elsewhere and more recently, on the 1st of November 1755, an earthquake hit the city of Lisbon in Portugal. Historic references state that about 40,000 people lost their lives from the tsunami that followed, inundating the town. Here's a map of Europe outlining areas that are prone to earthquakes, volcanoes, tsunamis, and landslides. Areas marked in yellow indicate areas with high probability of tsunamis because of tectonic activities. And if you look at the coast of Lisbon, a significant part of that is yellow. In fact, most of the Mediterranean coast, which is a popular holiday destination for us, is yellow. So what are we doing? What measures are we taking to protect ourselves, our families, and our properties from such events? I'm not saying that we should live in constant fear and paranoia. That's not very useful. But nor is turning a blind eye. Rather, we should actively be asking, what can we do as individuals and as a society to reduce the risks posed by such events? And in thinking about this question, the first and foremost fact to understand is that disasters are not natural. The United Nations defines disasters as, and I quote, "a serious disruption of the functioning of a community or society involving widespread human, material, economic, and environmental losses and impacts that exceeds the ability of the affected community or society to cope using its own resources." It doesn't state any of the hazards that we think about when we hear the term disasters, such as cyclones, earthquakes, and tsunamis. Rather, disasters are defined by the impact they have on a society, by the impact that the hazard has on a society. That is what defines a disaster. So what can we do to reduce the chances of a hazard becoming a disaster, to ensure that the affected communities can cope? We can commit to DRR, disaster risk reduction. As individuals and as consumers, we can put pressure on our leaders and relevant industries to actively invest in DRR measures, just as consumers put pressure on industries like food, cosmetics, and cleaning products to reduce health risks. The next time you plan a holiday, beyond the costs, the weather, and the recreational opportunities, ask hotels and resorts what DRR measures they implement. Do they have and do they communicate escape routes? How good is access to medical facilities? What barriers, be it natural or man-made, exist to protect the site? Here's a picture of an eco-resort from the southern coast of Sri Lanka that was affected by the 2004 Western Indian Ocean tsunami. Built right on the beach with a beautiful view of the ocean, not much was left of this resort, and 27 people lost their lives. Here's a picture of another eco-resort further up the coast. You cannot see the resort. Indeed, it's very well integrated into the landscape, and you can just make out the green roofs above the vegetation. Now, the business model of this 5-star eco-resort was a little different to that of the first one. And it wasn't just based on beach-related activities, but also for people to get to know the trees and plants of Sri Lanka. Locating the resort inland enabled them to plant trees and shrubs around the property, which over time led to the development of these sand dunes. How many people do you think died in this resort? Yeah, you're right, no one. Geologists and researchers who visited this site following the tsunami argue that it was the sand dunes and the vegetation that saved the lives and this property. Now, which resort would you have chosen had you known? But it's not all about holidays. As a society, we can also take measures for DRR. Locally, at home, or as a town or city community. We elect our leaders, and we have processes such as the referendum here in Switzerland. If we're informed, if we insist on good information about disasters in the past and their probability in the future, we can hold our leaders accountable for their commitment to DRR. For example, do you know if the mayor of your town or city has signed up to the United Nations campaign on making your city safe from disasters? Geneva and Lisbon have. Many of these mayors will be getting together this year in Geneva to discuss the progress they're making at the global platform for DRR. And also, if we're informed, if we insist on good information, we can use processes such as the referendum to have a much stronger voice in issues like property development in our city or town. Whatever the root cause of hazards, whether we believe in the scientific cause or God's wrath, we can do a lot to reduce the chances of a hazard becoming a disaster. It starts with being proactive, insisting on being informed, and using the power of consumer voice to influence business. And if you're an innovative business entrepreneur, you may be able to use business, shape and supply consumer demand. Just as health consciousness may govern what you buy in a supermarket and put into your bodies, let disaster risk consciousness inform your choice of home, your next holiday destination, and your involvement in local development decisions. Every effort and action matters, which brings me back to my childhood. My first day at school may have been on bare ground in a tent, but at home, I was luckier, thanks to my parents. On one of his work trips to Australia in the 1970s, my father visited a farm. It was the first time for him to see rows of trees planted and used as windbreaks. A few years later, when he built our family home in Fiji, you could not see the house from the road because of the dense jungle of trees around the property. And I remember those arguments with my brother on who would do what, when Mum would give us the chore of sweeping up all those leaves from those many trees. But the property was hardly damaged in almost all cyclones. In fact, it became a shelter for extended family and a relief center for things like clothing and bedding for neighbors following cyclones. And all because of some simple actions my parents took to reduce our risks to those disasters. Thank you. Thank you.